I'm Lauren. I'm the Data and Projects Manager for CTAP, which is the Clinical Trials Accelerator platform based in the Trust. And CTAP works basically to support delivery of CF clinical trials in the UK. We've got a network of trial centres for that. So, hello. I was wondering if Lizzie and Gov, you'd mind sort of introducing yourselves as sort of involvement group members.
Go on, Lizzie, you can go first.
Oh, thank you, Gus. Hi, I'm Lizzie. I've met some of you before. I have son Isaac, who is almost 18. He'll be 18 next week. And he has 2 class 1 mutations, so is not eligible for Kaftrio.
My name's Gov. I've got cystic fibrosis. I'm also not eligible for Kaftrio. I've got a 8-year-old son who keeps me on my feet. He's also called Isaac.
Good
Yeah,
choice.
yeah. So hello, everyone.
Thank you. Hello. And then if you wouldn't mind, the sort of Eric, Tim, and Jamie, maybe in that order, would you mind introducing yourselves? So sort of about who you are and what your involvement has been in sort of supporting genetic therapies research.
I'm Eric Alden. I think I've met probably most people on the screen before. I'm a respiratory physician. I got into CF because I was trying to put together a diagnostic test to measure the abnormal electricity in the noses, and we sort of put that together, and we're using that in our clinics here at the Brompton. And then the obvious thing was maybe you could use that test to see whether gene therapy was working or not. So from 1989 onwards, there was that possibility. And we've been doing that together with Edinburgh, Oxford and Imperial as the UK Respiratory Gene Therapy Consortium since 2001, which I've had the pleasure of coordinating since. You will know that you can't just deliver the gene, you have to wrap it in something. That something can either be fat globules, so non-viral gene therapy, and we took that all the way as far as we could do. We did a phase 2b clinical trial which showed a significant benefit compared to placebo, but in the world of modulators that clearly wasn't enough. And we've also been working in the background on a lentiviral platform with a Japanese company. It's the only virus we've ever come across that you can give repeatedly, and that's probably quite an important issue. And we've now been working for 5 years with Boehringer Ingelheim. They seem to like the product, and in a couple of years ago they licensed it, and it now belongs to them. We're working in partnership with them, and we're moving rapidly towards a big clinical program. And I think I'm allowed to say the first patient will be treated in the second half of this year.
Thank you very much. Tim?
Yeah, so I'm Tim Lee. I'm a consultant paediatrician at Leeds Children's Cystic Fibrosis Centre, and we care for about 240 children and young people who have cystic fibrosis. My interest in gene therapy comes from originally having a pharmacology degree and then doing a PhD, which was lab-based in the early 2000s, that was trying to look at how to improve the effectiveness of gene therapy. It was a lab-based project. And then since then, I've been involved more on the clinical trial side. So I've been director of the European CF Society Clinical Trial Network, and I'm involved in protocol review, both for the CF Foundation and in the States, and also the European Cystic Fibrosis Clinical Trial Network. And we're obviously helping to try and support these genetic therapies coming through to clinical trial.
And lastly, but not least, Jamie.
Oh, Lauren, you had to say that, isn't it? Oh no, hi everyone. I'm Jamie Duckers. I'm a cystic fibrosis consultant, and I care for adults with cystic fibrosis, and we're based in Cardiff, hence the rugby chat. So we look after about 350 people with CF, and obviously we take those that transitioning from the paediatrics, like from Tim's service, from the age of about 16. So I lead the research in Cardiff in the adult service, and we're part of the CTAP Centre, so research centre. So we're really keen to have research right at the heart of clinical care. So that's one of our passions. And I guess with the genetic therapies, we're really keen to bring all new treatments to people with CF, and it is one of the top priorities in the James Lind alliance that we've seen recently. So that's why we're really keen to make it happen. I think with my other hat on, the other bit of my day, I'm the lead for rare diseases in Wales. So obviously there's a little bit of cross-pollination there. So cystic fibrosis leads the way in lots of things. And there are a few rare diseases where there's lots of research going on in genetic conditions. So it's really interesting to sort of see the cross-pollination of that. But really nice to meet you guys.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So if you don't mind, I'm going to start things off with a couple of sort of pre-planned questions just to kind of prime the discussion. So the first one is who could benefit from CF genetic therapies? And anybody feel free to chime in with that.
Tim, Jamie.
Oh yeah, well, I guess leading on from what I just said is the we've had some great advances, haven't we, in cystic fibrosis? And as I said, in the rare disease arena, people look across to cystic fibrosis and they think, wow, everything's transformed with all these new drugs that have come and have been rolled out, all the media attention. But it's that around about 6% of people we know don't have, if you like, the right genes to qualify for the modulators that have received all that attention in the media. And not just that, actually, there are people that haven't seen a huge benefit with them or that can't tolerate them. So I think in answer to that question, Laura, it's those 6% that don't qualify. And quite often they are from a different ethnic background, potentially. And then the people that I mentioned that don't quite benefit from what's available. So I would say there's at least sort of 10% or more of people, when you add those categories of people living with CF together, it's that kind of number who have the potential to really benefit from these therapies that are coming. And eventually beyond that, there is the hope that with these therapies, you may be able to improve outcomes that are going on, and you will be able to reach the entire CF population. And I think the end line would be potentially, is there a cure? And that's what the sort of the thinking coming across would be, is that would be the end line, is that's what you really want to aim for.
Could I add one thing, Lauren, to Jamie's excellent thing, is the possibility of synergy with the modulators. So we certainly have quite a bit of data, and I think it's sort of obvious that ivacaftor should be synergistic with gene therapy, because we all know that what ivacaftor does is open the channel wider, as it were. Now we're putting in a normal protein, and the normal protein is only open 4/10 of the time, as it were. So ivacaftor should also open the normal protein more, maybe to 6/10 of the time or something. And indeed, it does do that. So the combination of adding in someone who's taken either Trikaftor or some modulator that includes ivacaftor, and then you add in gene therapy, you might get synergism and you might get a bigger bang for your buck.
Thank you. Oh, I can see, Lizzie, you've got a question. So do you want to fire away?
Yeah, sorry, just jumping on what Eric just said, would that only be for those people who the modulators would work for, or do you say there's a potential that people with like class 1 mutations could take a modulator to improve the efficacy of gene therapy?
Absolutely.
Oh, wow.
Because
Wow,
the
okay.
ivacaftor is, of course, without gene therapy, only relevant, obviously, to certain classes, as you know, as well as I do. Now what we're doing is putting in a normal copy of the protein, which is ivacaftorable. I'm sure there's no such word, but that sort of thing. And therefore, it should be a bonus and a synergism in theory, certainly in the laboratory, no idea in real life. And therefore, there should be synergism between the two.
I'm really glad that question came up, actually, because that was something that I was hoping would be answered here. So just going back to sort of the sort of other questions that we had. There are a few different types of genetic therapy, a few different terms that get thrown around. So I was wondering if you could explain what's the difference between things like DNA or gene therapy, RNA therapy, gene editing, and also this term antisense oligonucleotide therapy as well. So Tim, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I could maybe dive in first. And I think this is a really important area because I'm aware by talking to parents and young people in my clinic who are in a similar position, not currently having access to modulators because they don't have the right mutations, that their kind of feeling is that there might be just one type of mutation that isn't responsive to modulators, and therefore one new type of genetic therapy will definitely work for them. And that's not necessarily the case, but it does depend a little bit on exactly what type of genetic therapy we're talking about. So, for example, some people who can't currently access modulators have stop mutations, which is where no protein's produced at all because there's a premature signal in the machinery that stops the protein being made. Now they would benefit from gene therapy. They benefit from mRNA therapy because those therapies aren't mutation specific, but they could also benefit from more specific therapies. For example, a therapy is called read-through agents that can read through stop codes in the message. So that's one group of patients that are slightly different and could have potentially more options for these new genetic type therapies. There's another group of people who currently don't have access to modulators that have what we call splicing mutations, and that's where when the message is being processed, it's cut up in the wrong way, and then we don't get a proper code to produce the protein. Now, people in that category could potentially be treated by very short sequences of RNA that could be inhaled. And clinical trials are already started late end of last year for people with that kind of issue. Now, the difficulty for people in that category is there's lots and lots of different splicing mutations, and you need a very specific short sequence of RNA, which is called an antisense oligonucleotide, or ASO. And so they're going to have lots of bespoke potential models to try and treat people in that situation. The advantage of very short sequences is that they potentially could be absorbed into the lung more easily. And my understanding of the current clinical trials of those agents is that the scientists working on those think that they'll be absorbed actually without coating them either in fat globules or using a virus or other sort of vector. Then we get on to the what we call the agnostic therapies that could work for any mutations, such as longer sequences of mRNA that could code for the whole CF protein, or indeed the gene therapy that could code for the whole protein. And they could work for anybody, regardless of mutation, which is good news. The worst news about those sorts of therapies is that delivery may be harder to the lung, and they need wrapping in some kind of delivery system, such as fat globules or using viruses to deliver them. And we're getting more and more promising results, certainly in the laboratory, that we've got systems that are going to overcome the barriers that are in the lung. But if we can overcome those barriers, then the more gene agnostic types, so the mRNA therapies or the gene therapies, look like they're going to be because they can work for anybody regardless of mutation. That those are the most promising agents coming through. So I hope that's a brief synopsis of the different types. I haven't mentioned gene editing then, which I think is further away. We can perhaps come back to gene editing because that has more complexity. I don't know whether anyone wants to follow on from what I've just said.
I was just going to add a couple of things, but Liz has got her hand up first, I think.
I was just going to ask, given the challenges around funding for the modulator drugs, is there any of these options that is significantly more expensive and therefore potentially out of reach?
Pretty good question. I think teenage children don't know is the answer here, I think. But I think the cost of goods is such an important issue And one of the things that we're looking at is probably not much point in producing a gene therapy that has to be given every week, let's say, and is very costly, because I think the NHS will say, go away. And so there's a certain duration of action that you might need, so that you might only have to give it once every 6 months or 12 months or something, so the NHS could bear the cost. Now, that said, I'm sure you saw last week for some rare disease that the first dose was given, at Great Ormond Street, etc., at a cost of, I think it was £2.7 million for one dose. Now, I think we're anticipating we're going to come in well under that, but your comment is still extremely well taken, and I think it comes down, at least for us, and the calculations we're doing, is how often do you have to give it? Because if it was 50,000 a shot and you had to give it every day, I think the NHS would have apoplexy. If it's once a year, they might say, gosh, that's a bargain. So can I just add a couple of things to what Tim's very eloquently said? I guess in terms of the DNA therapy and the mRNA therapy, we're always thinking of its replacement. So if your car breaks down on the motorway, this is saying someone comes along and gives you a new car, but the old car remains on the motorway. The difference here with the gene editing is that what they're trying to do is to do the sort of RAC and come along and actually repair the old car and sort that out for you. You don't need a new car. So I think that's the sort of differences. They all have exactly the same problems as Tim mentioned. Everything here is about delivery. And although the gene editing is clearly magnificent and won the Nobel Prize and wondrous things, whether it's that applicable to the lung in vivo with all its defenses and barriers is just, I think it remains, to be fair to say, an open question. It's fantastic in the laboratory. It's beginning to pick up the same problems as we've all had over the time. I mean, please do, Tim and Jamie, disagree with me, but not in any way playing it down. What a technology! It's just a question, whatever the technology is, you're still got to get it there.
Yeah, I think definitely. But when I was saying about other rare diseases, Lizzie, there are these antisense nucleotides being used in other rare diseases, like Eric and Tim said, that the NHS are looking at. So there's a rare disease called spinal muscular atrophy that it's been used in, and I believe in sickle cell they're using gene editing, but it's exactly what Eric's saying. It's a different mechanism, and it's easier to do that in a blood disorder rather than a lung disorder. But the technology, I guess, is there. It's as you were all saying, it's about delivering it to the right place. That's going to be the challenge, isn't it, for us in cystic fibrosis?
And maybe we should also distinguish clearly between the DNA and the RNA, because the DNA has got to get from the outside through the cytoplasm and into the nucleus. So there are several barriers there. The RNA only has to get into the cytoplasm because that's where it works. So you're saving one important barrier. So why on earth would anybody not just do RNA? And the answer, I think, has been, first of all, you will understand that the RNA is broken down quite quickly because that's the way the cell works. And so you're going to have to keep on giving it. And it comes back, Lizzie, to your point about cost of goods. And certainly until recently, RNA has been not that stable. It's definitely getting better, but it hasn't been that stable. So you're talking about delivery every day or every 2 days or every week, that sort of thing. With the stuff that goes to the nucleus, what you're thinking about is it will last a lot longer if you can get it to the nucleus. And then it comes in two flavors, whether it just floats around the nucleus, so-called non-integrating, which is what the fat globules do, or integrating, which is, for example, what our lentivirus does, where it actually clips into your own genes. Now that brings with it stability. It gives you very, very long-lasting expression. Just brings with it the slight issue of, if it goes into your genes, where does it go into your genes? And if it does it randomly, could it do some mischief? And so, there are balances here to do, but I think that's the key difference between the DNA, lots of barriers, possibly long lasting, and the mRNA, less barriers. You might have to give it a lot.
There was something about gene therapy given as an IV, and yet, Eric, every time I've heard you talk about it, it's always been via nebuliser. And given my son's lungs aren't particularly good, I'm just wondering why nebulizer, why not IV?
Yeah, so you probably heard me talk about this before, Lizzie. I mean, why on earth would you not do it IV and hit all the organs? And we've spent probably 5+ years on the IV idea. I think one of the problems is, let's think about the lung first. When you give it IV, once it's gone through the heart and gone up into the lung has two different circulations. One blood circulation goes to the alveolar, the gas exchanging region, which as far as we know is roughly normal in CF. And that's the bit where the stuff tends to wedge and stay. You actually want to go past that, back into the heart and into a different bit of the circulation where it hits the conducting airways. And it's not so easy to do that. When you reach that bit, you reach the cells lining the blood vessels because you're giving it in the blood, obviously. And those are the endothelial cells. There's probably not much wrong with them. So you're asking your gene therapy, even if it got there, to go through the endothelium, through the sort of cells in between, and then finally reach the target cell. And at least in our hands, that's quite a tricky journey. The other thing is, of course, that the magic of give it intravenously and it'll sort out the pancreas, it'll sort out the gut, it'll sort out everything. Each of these organs has its own defense mechanisms. And our thinking, and maybe completely wrong, is you're going to have to still do it topically. So to get to the pancreatic duct, you may have to do it down, down a scope and then cannulate the pancreatic duct. It's not so easy in our hands, and that we may be completely wrong in terms of doing intravenously. Gosh, we've given it a good try.
Thank you.
Thank you, and don't apologise for asking questions because
please.
that's exactly what this session is for. So, I'll just Eric, you did sort of answer partly this question already, but just for kind of clarity's sake and to give Tim and Jamie a chance to chip in if they'd like to. The final question that I had was, how far along are we in terms of genetic therapies research for CF and by extension, how far off clinical trials? So just give Tim or Jamie if you'd like to add to Eric's nice answer.
Jamie, do you want to dive into that, or shall I?
Oh, yeah, no, just to say, well, so here in Cardiff, we're part of, obviously, the CF Trust, the Accelerator platform, which is, well, you'll correct me, Lauren, 25 sites that are all linked together to try and bring CF research right into the heart of clinical care. And we're also obviously part of the European Clinical Trials Network that Tim mentioned. And yes, as a site, as one of the early phase sites, we are hopefully going to start what Eric was talking about, working with Vertex, which is an early phase. That's a phase 1 study, which they're looking at mRNA therapy. So we will be starting that later on this year. And then I know that the European Clinical Trials Network are also putting out interest. So they're going out to sites to look about gene therapy trial coming out as well. So obviously the thing to say is that usually the trials will go very small number of people in an early phase, and they'll be really concentrating on, is it a safe treatment, really, rather than looking at any changes, particularly in lung function, etc. Obviously, they'll measure those, but the first initial trials will be, is this safe and is it tolerable? So as I said, we're looking forward to doing that. I guess to follow on from Eric's question, there's going to be carefully choosing people who are eligible, who want to do it, because it is quite a large time commitment for people with CF. These trials, because they're early phase, it's smaller numbers of people involved, but it is quite intense. So obviously that's what we're going through at the moment, is making sure that we're set up as a site to do it all safely, effectively, and that we're communicating with the people with CF who are eligible to check, are they interested and are they aware of what these trials are? So I would just obviously alert people to the trials tracker to make sure that people are aware of what is available nearby. And the whole idea with these early phase centres, so I think there are 6 early phase centres in the UK, is that everybody should have the ability to go into one of these trials if they're within the UK. It may not be at your local CF centre, but you should be able to access a trial at the nearest centre to you. So that's really important, because obviously we want the trials to be open to everybody and to be equitable. And as I said, these early phases are more about safety. It's smaller numbers, it is intense. And then what you'll see is it will go down in the age groups. So it will then go down more into pediatrics. But obviously, usually these therapies are started in adults and then come down in the age brackets. Sorry, Tim, I butted into you.
No, not at all. That was really helpful, Jamie. The other thing I'd add to what you've said is that although these early phase trials are often first in human, the safety that's looked at before we get to that stage is immense. As I know from protocol review, whoever is taking one of these new agents into clinical trial has already done lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of studies to check safety. And I won't go into details about exactly how those studies are done, but you could guess the sorts of the sort of studies that are done to make sure that when we get into humans, they're as safe as they possibly can be. And the only way we can make progress is by us all being really enthusiastic to participate in these studies. We wouldn't have Kaftrio if it hadn't been for lots and lots of adults and then eventually children with cystic fibrosis volunteering to be in the studies. We just wouldn't have these drugs. So it's the same with the genetic therapies. To work together in partnership, carefully, safely, and methodically to actually bring these through to clinic is going to be a partnership, and a really important partnership in the years ahead. And it is really exciting that these mRNA therapies, as Eric mentioned, are now in clinical trial, and the some of the gene therapies are actually in clinical trial this year in 2023. It is fantastic, and it looks like the pipeline over the next year or two is going to be really amazing, and one that we need to manage carefully.
So again, I'd hark back to, with my rare disease hat on, we are the envy in cystic fibrosis of lots of rare diseases because we have a really good registry. And I know that the registry will be very key as well in looking at the long-term follow-up of people with CF on any clinical trials potentially on, and this is much further down the line from genetic therapies, but for example, in checking post-authorization safety in following data and really adding to what the community have, because the community owns it. I didn't know if I saw Gov's hand up.
Yeah,
sorry.
I was going to say, conscious of time, I think we'll open it up a little bit more to some questions from Lizzie and Gov. So Gov, if do you have any sort of burning questions that you'd like to start with? Yeah,
one thing is going back from the previous sort of meetings we've had is so people with CF, personally myself, my lung function is not getting any better. It's always going down. No matter how much treatment I do, how much exercise I do, whatever I do, it just seems to be either there or dropping. So my question is, would I be eligible for any kind of trials, or would it always have to be where my FEV is, the result of that, or do I have a choice to say, look at that, I want to have a trial anyway? Can I do that? I'm not sure.
Jamie, do you want to take that?
Yeah, Gov, it's a question we get asked lots of the trials. In each trial, they'll set their own, the company running it will set their own inclusion and exclusion criteria for the trial. And it does vary from trial to trial, but quite often they'll set a lower lung function of about 40% or 50%, and they quite often set a top figure, and it's usually 90 or 100% of predicted. What I would say about that is that we saw it, for example, with the modulators with Kaftrio, is that actually then the company brought out, when they'd finished their study, that they did have an early access scheme for people outside of those lung function. And actually, even when people go into the trial, sometimes people lung function changes during the trial. And they did look at the outcome with that drug outside of what was that agreed lung function when people went in, we also get similar questions asked with different bugs that people have in their chest. And again, different trials will have different inclusion and exclusion. And I'd really say, Gov, you know, I know it's frustrating because you're working really hard to keep the lung function up, but really going, and I'd hope your team are talking to you about what trials are available for you, and to say that even if you didn't meet that trial, often that it will, hopefully, when these come to the actual, what we call the shop floor or the clinic floor, if you like, to become available, then your team will look at how they could access that for you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
The other point, I suppose, Gov, I'm wondering whether you or Lizzie were going to raise was, at the end of the trial, assuming it's successful, then what's going to happen? And you know, there's quite a long history of doing trials in general, not just in CF, where you do it, you give it, that's the end of the material, and then people go away and reflect. And even if you did improve, then people deteriorate again. And would encourage people who are entering into these trials to look at, see what the follow-on suggestions are of the companies, and whether there's going to be an open label extension. You know, I got better, I really don't want to get worse again. You know, those sort of things.
Yeah,
Absolutely, yeah, and at whatever the cost. Eric, I know that we spoke in, was it January last time? And just a little insight into the mind of a teenager. I spoke to Isaac after that about the trial and the time commitment and you know, being in that box for an hour and whatnot. And at first he was like, oh no, I mean, absolutely, his lung function is not completely car crash, but he has quite frequent exacerbations. So he has IVs about 6 times a year. And he has been very poorly in intensive care before in the past. So he's spent long periods of time in hospital. And so to him, his least favourite thing is to be in hospital. And we almost always do IVs at home now, partly because of the fact that he just doesn't want to go in. And that's a way of keeping him compliant with doing things. But he came back to me a few days later, and he sort of, you know, when I'd sort of given him the, you know, the full shebang and kind of like, you know, but the long-term possibility of much better health and much less frequent interventions and daily burden. And he sort of came back to me a few days later and sort of said, yeah, you know, I would do it. And I think it took him that time to absorb the information, but he could see that whatever the commitment would be at first, it would be worth it. But going back to your point about the length of the study, and given we're at this really exciting time, I mean, it feels to me like I remember speaking about gene therapy and hearing you talk, Eric, when Isaac was a baby, and I remember our consultant at the time saying, I said, when would it be too late for him? And she said, well, his lungs will probably be, you know, scarring will begin at this age, and we need to get to his lungs before they're too damaged. And thinking, you know, possibly that we'd miss the boat at some point, especially after he was very poorly. But it's now we're at this stage where all of these exciting things are happening suddenly, and it feels like after a long lull of kind of like not much activity and then huge amounts of publicity about the modulator drugs. And obviously I was over the moon about those, but always knew that they wouldn't work for Isaac. But that idea of sort of signing up for something for the 15-year, you know, you've got to stick with this one study. Do you think, I suppose my question after that long ramble, sorry, is that do you think if we were in that case, that any rules like that could be overridden by like compassionate rules if you were at sort of end stage CF or something where, you know, you're on a trial, it hasn't had the best effect on you, perhaps there's another trial that's even more promising, would they consider overriding it?
Yes, I mean, I can only conjecture, but I don't see why not. And certainly when we talk to the regulators, they see different phases of follow-up. They don't see the 15 years as being all the same, as it were. And they see maybe 3 phases of the first year, when obviously you want to be really hyper acutely sensitive to what's going on. And then maybe the sort of 2 to 5 years where you want to just be a bit more vigilant than usual. And then maybe the sort of 6 to 15-year period could just be routine clinical care. So I think there are differences. That doesn't really address your question of, can we make the patients switch. It didn't work. Leave me alone. I want to switch to something else. And I just bow to Tim and Jamie's view, but I do think a bit of patient power and a bit of CF trust and CFF power might be needed here, because we understand the purity of how trials should be run, but that's not the real world. And you're saying getting towards sort of poorer lung function, I can't wait 15 years. I'm not going to wait 15 years. And a bit of sort of tantrum at the supermarket would probably help, I personally think, but hand over to the experts.
I agree, Eric. We're always told in clinical trials when we're running them that the welfare and safety of the participants are paramount. That's the paramount responsibility of anyone running a clinical trial, and that includes whether that current clinical trial that they're in is still the best thing for them. If there's another better clinical trial for them, or indeed approved drug that's suddenly arrived for them. So I think we should all advocate very strongly that the person with CF, their needs and welfare and priorities should be paramount, both in the way protocols are designed and in the way trials are run when we're running different genetic therapy trials. I was really inspired by what you said about your son, and what you said to your son about this is an opportunity to really make a positive difference. That yes, there will be some sacrifice in terms of potentially being in an inpatient unit for an early phase study of a genetic therapy, but the positivity for real positive change for this disease that we all want to see much better treatments for was fantastic to hear. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Gov, do you have sort of another question, or Lizzie? I have a question that I can ask, but I want to give you both opportunity to ask.
I'm okay at the moment. So
Okay.
Sorry, I was going to say, I always have about 1,000 questions. Sorry. It's almost like my dream dinner party audience here. I'd love to invite you all round and we could chat about it all night. But you'd get sick of me, I'm sure.
We're on the way.
Yeah.
You haven't seen my cooking. I was going to ask, I mean, obviously we're talking about gene therapy here, specifically targeting the lungs. And I know with the CF modulator drugs, we've had some other benefits to other sort of aspects of CF. Do you anticipate that there could be some, if your lungs are more healthy, could that then in turn impact things like liver health and digestive problems?
I'm happy to give it a go. My feeling is that we're going to have to target each organ individually unless we take your lead and do it intravenously, and I was completely wrong, we could get it to work. So just from the practical science bit, lung tick done, you might have to then go topically, but I think there are other components of that question which I'll pass on to Jamie and Tim.
Yeah, no, I agree, Eric. I think, Lizzie, with the science bit, that you're going to be inhaling it onto your lung and having that topically. But I get your point that theoretically you could see that potentially quality of life might improve, that because you've had potentially better lung function or better ability to do other things, that you may feel benefits outside of the lungs. I'm not aware of any evidence for that, but I wonder if there is a possibility of that, although you are treating the lung, and it would be interesting to look at the outcomes of that.
I was thinking quite specifically about Dios. Isaac gets lots of obstructions, and I'm thinking just that, if his lung health was better and he was able to exercise and move more freely, even, those sort of smaller benefits, like incrementally, might really improve his digestive health as well.
Yeah, I get the logic of that, and yeah, it would be very interesting to see. Yeah,
I'm ever an optimist.
I think there's some evidence that liver health, in particular, is affected by infection in the lung, and actually liver outcomes for people with cystic fibrosis have improved a lot as lung outcomes have improved without any specific therapy necessarily to the liver. So Yes, whilst we're also wanting to think about how to target all these organs specifically, I think there will be roll-on benefits, hopefully, from just treating the lungs in the first wave.
I suppose, are we able to look at post-transplant data to see what impact that would have on liver disease and other complications, I guess?
Yeah, good question. I'll defer probably to Jamie, who's more experienced of post-transplant than me.
Sorry, Lizzie, do you mean to see what happens post-lung transplant to...
Yeah, on other aspects of CF disease. So other aspects, you know, if you had mild liver disease, for example, are post-lung transplant, are you more likely to have better liver disease?
Yeah, we do see it, although there's quite a lot of confounding factors there, because a lot of the medications that you take following a lung transplant can affect your liver and your kidneys, for example. But definitely what we do see is we see a massive change in people's quality of life. We see a change in their weight, definitely. We do see a change in their bowels, and a lot to do with, like you were mentioning earlier, and you're sort of inferring for Isaac, would be that increase in activity levels, that change in what people can do very quickly post lung transplant, actually. But I would just, you know, make that point of extrapolating that from lung transplant is different because of the medications. And of course, at the moment, for things like the gene therapy that I've seen, you wouldn't be eligible post lung transplant, if that makes sense, to enter that trial. So just to make that, but I take you and Tim's point. The other things that may change are things like diabetic control, potentially, if you're having less exacerbations and you're more active. But again, I'm not aware of that data, but I think it would be really interesting to watch that space and see if you can change people's lung and the number of exacerbations and how active they can be, what else can change in other organs.
As well as the psychological aspects, you know.
Oh yeah, and that is something we're seeing in adult cystic fibrosis care is huge, and I'm really glad that there seems to be a lot more attention and activity in managing mental health. Certainly in cystic fibrosis, there's a lot going on, which is good to see.
Just conscious of time, we're nearly at 7:30, so maybe just one or two more questions and then we'll wrap up. Lizzie, I know you've got your hand up, so fire away.
Sorry, as always. Just very quickly, in terms of when can we sign up for trials? And also, I know, Eric, I asked you about this last time, whether any of the follow-up appointments and stuff could be done at our local hospitals, and you said probably yes. But do we know that all local hospitals, we're at the Royal Papworth Hospital, do you think all centres will be willing to do that and be on board to kind of have a, you know, follow-up appointments at local hospitals rather than coming to the Brompton?
So I'll pass on to Tim and Jamie about other trials. I can only speak about our one in any sort of detail. So the answer to your second question is yes, we're assuming all follow-up can be done at the local hospitals, apart from the bronchoscopy, which is the one thing that probably will need to be done at the centre which delivered the study. Sorry, your first question was the first.
When can we sign up?
Yeah, well,
I mean, how soon really are you going to be asking for participants?
Okay, so for our study, I'm only authorised to say it will begin in the second half of this year. So we will be looking for volunteers, you know, quite soon, second half of this year.
Okay.
But I think Jamie and Tim will know more about the Vertex and other studies. So
yeah, the Vertex one is hopefully opening second part of the year, I believe. And yeah, Lizzie, I think the value of this connecting all the CF centres together that are part of this CTAP platform is to try and really make research as equitable across the whole UK. And if there's not a local centre that offers it, to be able to go to a regional one, and then the onus is to try to streamline that research as much as possible within the protocol to make travel, etc. And a lot of the trials are being designed, not particularly for the gene therapy itself, but we've had lots of trials that are using remote monitoring and visits and consent. As Eric was saying, some of the more intense early phase trials, that part may not be possible,
Sure.
but the linking between your local and the regional centre that might be offering that trial. Yeah, so we'd be very keen, and also with these trials, the smaller numbers of people going into them, although they're more intense. So the research teams, and they're often, we have a research coordinator embedded, and they all know each other, they speak to each other, they have their own platform to really link the clinical teams in with the research teams to try and streamline that process as best we can. Because we know it's a big ask to go into a trial, and these trials, you know, we accept that they take a lot of people's time and commitment, especially when people are trying to work and etc. etc. So we are aware it is a big ask to do, not just for the individual, but you know, obviously for members of the family as well.
I think yeah, I completely agree. It's also, I think, you know, obviously there's all the potential huge benefits, but also it's quite an honor to be part of something that's such, you know, exciting science and something so new. And maybe, you know, we can look back in 20 years' time and say we were part of that, and that's really lovely thought as well.
What a nice comment. Thank you so much. Because, you know, there's an awful lot of, you know, the ducks paddling analogy. There's an awful lot of stuff that goes on underwater over the last 30 years to get to this point. And, you know, there's paddling going on 24 hours a day, but it often doesn't look like it. So it's a very nice comment.
Gov, is just to give you final opportunity as well. If there's anything you'd like to ask, otherwise I'm happy to leave it there. But
I think everything Lizzie has asked is probably what I would. There's a lot of information to take in just from that. So yeah, she's said it all really, to be honest with you.
Well, it's quite a nice place to leave it anyway. If anyone has any sort of final remarks, would like to say anything, kind of from the panel, or any final remarks. Otherwise, I will close it there. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and also for making my job really easy, because I didn't have to interfere very much, and it was very, very nicely flowing. So thank you, everybody.